The first time Lucy Aldridge told a man to leave her alone, she meant it with every jagged piece of her broken heart. But the second time she said it to Louis Shelby, standing in the dust outside Caldwell, Kansas in the blazing summer of 1878, he only tilted the brim of his hat and smiled like trouble was the only language he had ever been fluent in. Caldwell sat at the edge of the Chisholm Trail like a man leaning against a fence post, half drunk and wholly dangerous. It was a cattle town with ambitions, full of drovers and gamblers and merchants who sold things a person probably should not have needed so badly. The wind came off the Oklahoma Territory to the south and brought with it red dust and the smell of grass baked dry by a sun that had no mercy for anyone. The town had 2 saloons, a land office, a telegraph station, a livery, a general store, a church that saw less business than either saloon, and a boarding house run by a widow named Mrs. Cora Pruitt who kept a shotgun behind the front desk and a Bible on top of it. Lucy Aldridge had been living at Mrs. Pruitt's boarding house for 3 weeks when Louis Shelby rode into Caldwell with the rocking T cattle drive from Texas. She had arrived from St. Louis with a carpet bag, a leather satchel full of medical instruments, and a letter from the county physician in Sedgwick County who had agreed, somewhat reluctantly, to allow her to serve as his assistant in a territory so vast and underserved that he could not afford to be choosy. Lucy was 24 years old, trained in practical nursing and field medicine under a doctor in St. Louis who had run a charity clinic on the east side of the city. She was not a licensed physician. Women were not licensed physicians in 1878 Kansas, at least not anywhere that would have mattered to the men who made such decisions. But she knew how to stitch a wound, set a bone, reduce a fever, and recognize the early signs of cholera, which was no small thing in a cattle town where men drank from whatever water source happened to be nearby. She was tall for a woman of her time. With dark hair she kept pinned under a plain cotton bonnet when she worked, and brown eyes that could read a person's condition before they had finished explaining themselves. She was not what most people in Caldwell would have called conventionally pretty, though that was a matter of considerable debate among those who bothered to look past the clinical efficiency with which she moved through a room. What she was, unmistakably, was capable, and in a place like Caldwell, capability in a woman was either deeply respected or deeply resented, and there was rarely any telling which until it was too late. She had her reasons for leaving St. Louis. She did not talk about them. Louis Shelby was 27 years old and had been riding cattle drives up the Chisholm Trail since he was 19. He was the kind of man the trail built slowly, the way a river carves a canyon, one season at a time, until the stone of a person's character is shaped by forces too patient and too powerful to argue with. He was broad through the shoulders and lean everywhere else, with dark blonde hair that the sun had been bleaching for 8 consecutive summers and gray eyes that were the particular shade of quiet that sometimes gets mistaken for coldness. He was not cold. He was careful, which is a different thing entirely, though in the world of cattle drives and border towns, careful men were sometimes feared more than reckless ones because you could not always predict what they would do. He was the trail boss's second in command on the rocking T drive, and when the herd came north through the territory and into Kansas with the summer dust rising around 500 longhorns like a red curtain being drawn across the horizon, he was the man who rode at the right flank and kept everything organized. His name among the other drovers was simply Shelby, and it was said with a kind of shorthand respect that meant more than any lengthier compliment would have. The rocking T drive pulled into the holding pen south of Caldwell on a Thursday afternoon in late July, and the drovers who had been riding for 3 months through heat and rain and river crossings, and one genuinely terrifying night when lightning struck the herd, and caused a stampede that killed 2 steers, and broke a man's collarbone came off their horses, with the particular exhaustion of people who have been alive in the most punishing sense of the word. The first thing most of them wanted was a bath. The second was a meal that had not been cooked over a trail fire, and the third was whatever the saloon had to offer. Louis wanted all of those things too, but he also needed to find a doctor. The man whose collarbone had broken during the stampede was named Hector Vargas, and Hector had ridden the remaining week and a half of the drive with his arm bound to his chest, with a length of canvas and a great deal of personal courage, and considerably more whiskey than was medically advisable. By the time they reached Caldwell, the collarbone had begun to knit wrong, and his shoulder sat at an angle that looked wrong even to someone with no medical training. Hector was 22 and had been riding since he was 15, and he was trying very hard to pretend that his shoulder did not feel like something was on fire inside it. Louis found Dr. Emmett Graves's office on the main street, a narrow building wedged between the land office and a bootmaker, with a painted sign in the window that listed his hours and services. The door was locked. A handwritten note on the door said that Dr. Graves had been called to a farm 6 miles east and would return by evening. He was standing there reading the note for the second time when he heard a woman's voice from the alley beside the building. "The collarbone, I assume," the voice said. "I can tell by the way he is holding that arm." Louis turned. Lucy Aldridge was standing in the mouth of the alley with a clean apron over her dress and a leather bag hanging from one shoulder. She was looking not at Louis but at Hector, who was sitting on the edge of the boardwalk with his hat in his good hand and sweat on his face that was only partly from the heat. "Doctor's gone," Louis said. "I know where Dr. Graves is," Lucy said, already moving toward Hector. "I work with him. May I look?" She asked Hector, not Louis. Louis noticed that. Hector, who had been raised to be polite to women and also who was in considerable pain, said yes, and Lucy set her bag on the boardwalk and knelt beside him without any of the hesitation that Louis might have expected from someone encountering a dusty, trail-worn drover in a narrow boardwalk in a cattle town. She pressed her fingers carefully along his shoulder and Hector sucked in a breath. "How long ago?" she asked. 11 days, Hector said. She said something that was not quite a curse but lived in the same neighborhood as one. "It has started to set wrong. I need you to come inside. Dr. Graves left me a key and the supplies are all here. This is going to be uncomfortable." "More uncomfortable than the last 11 days, Hector asked. "Yes," Lucy said, and Hector laughed, which surprised Louis. Louis held the door while she unlocked it and got Hector settled inside. He watched her work, because he was the kind of man who paid attention to things that were worth paying attention to. And what he saw was a woman who knew exactly what she was doing, who spoke to Hector in plain language that did not talk down to him, who had steady hands and a calm voice, and who did not ask permission before she made a decision about how best to help. She repositioned the collarbone, which required a splint and a proper binding, and caused Hector to press his mouth tight and breathe through his nose for a long moment, and then she told him to rest it for 3 weeks and not to let anyone talk him into using that arm for anything. When she was done, she washed her hands in a basin and dried them on a clean cloth, and that was when she looked at Louis for the first time with any real attention. "He will be fine," she said. "The knitting will take time, but if he is careful, it should heal cleanly." "Thank you," Louis said. "What do we owe you?" "That is for Dr. Graves to determine," she said. "Come back when he has returned this evening." "I meant you," Louis said, "for your time." She looked at him with those brown eyes that had already catalogued most of what there was to know about a person before the conversation was properly begun. "I am not a physician," she said. "I do not charge fees." "You did a physician's work," Louis said. "That is kind of you," she said, in a tone that suggested she did not particularly require his kindness. She began packing her bag with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had a great deal more to do that day. Louis was not sure what possessed him to stay. He got Hector settled on the bench outside and told him to wait for the evening, and then he leaned against the door frame of the office, which was perhaps not the most sophisticated thing he had ever done, and said, "Are you from here?" "No," she said. "St. Louis," he guessed, based on something in the way she spoke, a Midwestern formality that had not been worn off by frontier living. She glanced at him with a flicker of something that might have been surprise. St. Louis, she confirmed. Long way from home, he said. This is home now, she said, and it came out with a firmness that was clearly meant to close the subject. He should have let it close. He was not sure why he did not. How long have you been in Caldwell? She stopped packing and looked at him directly with the particular patience of a woman who has run out of patience. Why? She asked. I was making conversation, he said. You were making curiosity sound like conversation, she said. They are not the same thing. Fair enough, he said and smiled. She did not smile back. 3 weeks, she said despite herself. I have been in Caldwell 3 weeks. Do you like it? She considered the question with more seriousness than it might have warranted. I like the work, she said. The town is loud. Cattle towns usually are. You would know, she said, looking at his boots and his trail-worn coat and his hat, which even after 3 months on the trail was still cared for in the particular way of a man who knew the value of small dignities. You are a drover. Trail boss's second, he said. Louis Shelby. She looked at him as if weighing whether the name was worth filing away. Lucy Aldridge, she said, and then immediately looked like she had perhaps not intended to say it. Miss Aldridge, he said, trying the name out. Good afternoon, Mr. Shelby, she said, which was clearly a goodbye dressed up in politeness. He pushed off the door frame and tipped his hat and left, because he was not a man who pushed where he was not wanted, but he was also, if he was honest with himself, standing in the July heat of the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, a man who had just filed that name very carefully in the part of his mind where important things were kept. He came back the next morning. He told himself he was coming to check on Hector, which was true. Hector was doing better, and Dr. Graves, who had returned the previous evening, confirmed that whoever had reset the collarbone had done it correctly and that Hector should heal well. Louis thanked the doctor, and then, because he had thought of nothing particularly sensible to do instead, he walked to the boarding house where the doctor had mentioned Lucy worked mornings and asked Mrs. Prout if he might leave a message. Mrs. Prout, who was 60 years old and had not survived the frontier by missing things that happened under her own roof, looked at Louis Shelby with the specific assessment of a woman who has seen every variety of man come through her door and has developed strong opinions about most of them. You can leave a message, she said, or you can sit in the parlor and wait. She takes breakfast here before she goes to the office. He sat in the parlor. He was not entirely sure why. Lucy came downstairs 20 minutes later in her working dress with her hair still slightly damp at the edges from washing, and she stopped on the bottom step when she saw him sitting in Mrs. Prout's parlor with his hat on his knee. Mr. Shelby, she said, with a caution in her voice that was not quite alarm but lived nearby. I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday, he said, standing. And I wanted to bring you these. He held out a brown paper package. From the general store, sugar candy. The woman at the counter said it was good. Lucy looked at the package for a long moment. You bought me sugar candy, she said. Is that strange? Most men who come calling bring flowers, she said. There aren't any flowers in Caldwell worth cutting, he said. Not in this heat. I thought something practical was better. She was quiet for a moment, and then something in her face moved, not quite a smile but the shape that lived before a smile. That is actually a reasonable argument, she said. She took the candy. She did not invite him to stay. But she did not ask him to go, which he took as the kind of cautious progress that a man with any sense ought to recognize and appreciate. He came back the following day, and the day after that. The rocking tea drive was done, and the trail boss, a weathered man named Cal Ritter who had been running cattle north for 15 years, had given the drovers 10 days of liberty in Caldwell before the ride south. Louis used his liberty in ways that surprised even him. He helped Mrs. Prout fix a broken step on her front porch, because he had seen Lucy nearly catch her foot on it, and it seemed like a thing worth fixing. He sat in on a town meeting about the new water pump on the south end of town, and listened to an argument about municipal funding that seemed to interest him about as much as it interested everyone else who was there, which was very little. He learned that the saloon on the north end of town made a tolerable cup of coffee in the mornings if you got there before the gambling started. He discovered that Caldwell had a small lending library run out of the back of the church, which was managed by the minister's wife, and contained approximately 40 books, most of them donated and ranging in quality from very good to genuinely baffling. He told Lucy about the library on the fourth morning he found her at the boarding house before she left for the office, and she looked at him with something that was unmistakably real interest. 40 books, she said. At least 40, he said. There may be more in the back. She said she had not counted lately. I have been looking for something to read, Lucy said. Evenings are long here. I know the minister's wife, he said. Well, I know who she is. She seems like she would let you borrow something. You would introduce me, she asked. If you want, he said. She studied him for a moment with those reading eyes of hers. Why are you doing this? She asked, and it was a real question, not an accusatory one. There was something genuinely uncertain in it, like a person who had grown so accustomed to motives being something other than what they appeared that they had forgotten how to accept simple ones. Doing what? He asked. Coming here, she said. Fixing Mrs. Pruitt's step, telling me about the library, bringing sugar candy. He thought about it because he was a man who thought before he answered when the answer mattered. I like talking to you, he said. You say what you mean. She looked at him as though this explanation was either very simple or very complicated, and she had not yet determined which. Most men find that off-putting, she said. Then most men have been a nuisance to you, he said. That's their problem, not yours. Something in her shifted very slightly, the way a door shifts when someone on the other side has leaned against it. Not open, but less firmly closed. Come on then, she said. I have an hour before the office opens. Show me this library. The minister's wife was a small, energetic woman named Margaret Cole, who was deeply pleased to have a new reader, and even more deeply pleased to have someone to talk to about the books she had already lent out and gotten back. And Lucy spent 45 minutes in the back room of the church talking with Margaret Cole about a novel she had read 3 times and a medical text she had not expected to find in a lending library. And Louis sat on a bench near the door and listened to the 2 women talk and felt something in his chest that was warm and not entirely comfortable. The way warmth sometimes is when a person has been cold for a long time. He had not been looking for this. That was the most accurate thing he could have said about it. He had ridden into Caldwell looking for a bath and a meal and a physician for Hector Vargas's collarbone, and he had found a woman who said what she meant and fixed broken things and talked about books like they were alive. And now he was sitting in the back room of a church library in a cattle town in Kansas and not regretting any of it. On the walk back to the boarding house, Lucy said, "The drive is over." "When do you leave?" 6 days, he said. She nodded. "Back to Texas." "Back to the ranch," he said. "In the hill country south of San Antonio. The Rocking T. I work for them full time. Drive in the summer, ranch work in the fall and winter." "Do you own any land?" she asked, and then stopped herself. "I am sorry, that is not my business." "It is not a rude question," he said. "No, not yet. I have been saving. I want to buy something of my own in the next 2 or 3 years. Maybe here in Kansas, maybe further west. There's land in the territory if a man is willing to work for it." She was quiet for a moment. They were walking along the main street in the early morning light, and the town was just beginning to wake up around them. A dog crossing the street ahead, a man opening the shutters on the general store, the smell of bread from somewhere. "What you are describing," she said carefully, "is a life that has not happened yet." "That is true of most lives worth living," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You are not what I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" She thought about it honestly. "Most drovers who come through here want the saloon," she said, "and company, and they leave without giving much thought to what they leave behind." "I know men like that," he said. "Aren't you one of them?" She asked, and it was direct, not cruel, just the kind of question she asked because she needed to know the answer. "I used to be more like them than I am now," he said. "The trail changes you. Not always for the better, but sometimes." She stopped walking and looked at him fully for the first time since they had left the church. The sun was up enough now to do things to the light on the dusty street, and she was standing with her bag on her shoulder and her bonnet tied under her chin, and she looked in that moment like someone who had made a decision but had not yet said it out loud. "I am not worth the trouble of knowing," she said. It was not self-pity. It was something more deliberate than that, something that sounded like a warning she had given before and meant before. I do not say that to be modest. I say it because I have been told it and because my circumstances are such that I believe there is truth to it. He looked at her steadily. "What circumstances?" he asked. "I left St. Louis because I had to," she said. "My reputation there was complicated. There was a man, and a situation that was not my fault but that everyone in my community chose to believe was because it was easier than the alternative." She paused. "I am not going to tell you the whole story right now. But I want you to know that whoever you think you are getting to know, you are not getting to know someone without history." "Everyone has history," he said. "Mine is more inconvenient than most," she said. He looked at the dust on his boots for a moment and then back up at her. "I have never found trouble worth avoiding," he said. "In my experience, the things that seem like trouble from the outside are usually the only things that turn out to be worth anything." She stared at him. Not like she did not believe him, but like she was parsing the meaning of something and not sure she had gotten it right the first time. "That is either very wise or very reckless," she said. "Probably both," he said. She did not say anything for a long moment. Then she said, "I have to get to the office," and she left. But when she was 20 feet away, she turned back and said, "Thank you for showing me the library," and her voice had something in it that it had not had yesterday. It was enough. For now, it was enough. He had 4 more days in Caldwell. He spent them the way a man spends time when he knows it is limited but he has not yet let himself think too clearly about the limit. He helped Dr. Graves carry a cast iron stove from the livery to the office because Graves had purchased it and had no way to transport it himself, and Louis was there and had a horse. He played cards one evening in the saloon with 3 of the other rocking tea drovers, and won a moderate amount, and donated most of it to the next round of drinks, and came out approximately even, which he considered a success. He had 2 long conversations with Hector about whether Hector should go back to Texas with the drive or try his luck in Kansas for a while, and he told Hector honestly that Kansas was full of opportunity if a man was willing to work hard, and that there was no shame in wanting something different than the trail. Hector, who had been thinking about a cousin in Wichita and a girl he had met at a church dance 3 months ago who lived somewhere in the territory, decided to stay in Kansas. Louis helped him find a room and spoke a good word for him with the livery owner, who was looking for someone who knew horses, which Hector certainly did. And every morning he found Lucy at the boarding house or at the office or walking the main street on some errand, and they talked about the town, about medicine, about cattle and land and the Kansas sky, which was genuinely enormous and blue in a way that people who had not seen it did not quite believe when you described it. About the life she had left in St. Louis, which she told him in pieces, the way a person peels bark off a tree, not all at once, just enough to show what is underneath. The man in St. Louis had been a doctor, Dr. Philip Hartley. She had worked in his clinic and she had believed for a year that his interest in her was professional, and then she had discovered it was something else, and when she refused him, he had made certain that the story told around their community was one in which she was the person at fault. She had lost her place at the clinic. She had lost the regard of people she had thought of as friends. She had lost the apartment she rented from a woman who had known Dr. Hartley for 20 years. The letter from the Sedgwick County physician had come from a contact of her former mentor in St. Louis, the only doctor who had believed her account of things, and who had used his influence to find her a position far enough away that Hartley's version of events had not yet traveled. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go," she said. They were sitting on the bench outside the boarding house on the 5th evening, after supper, with the town settling into its nightly noise around them, and the sky going purple and amber to the west. And because I am good at this work, and I refuse to stop doing it because of him. You should not have to refuse anything, Louis said. You should not have had to leave at all. No, she said, I should not have, but that is not how things work. It is not how things work now, he said. That does not mean it cannot be different. She looked at the amber sky. You are optimistic, she said. I am realistic, he said. Realistic about the fact that things change. Not fast enough and not always fairly, but they change. The trail is different than it was 10 years ago. Towns like this are different than they were 5 years ago. People's ideas change too, given enough time and enough argument. I am not very patient, she said. You seem patient to me, he said. I have learned to seem patient, she said. It is a useful skill in a cattle town. He laughed, and she looked at him with genuine warmth for the first time, the kind that does not calculate itself before it appears, and it changed her face in a way that made him realize she had been beautiful for some time, and he had only just understood it in the full sense of the word. He left the next morning with the rocking tea drive. He stood at the edge of town in the early gray light with his horse saddled and his bedroll tied, and all the other drovers moving around him in the organized chaos of a group of men about to ride 500 miles south, and he felt something he had not expected to feel, which was that the leaving was wrong in a way that leaving had never been wrong before. He had always liked the leaving. The trail was free, and the horizon was always new, and there was a particular pleasure in movement that he had never thought to question. But standing in the gray morning light on the edge of Caldwell, Kansas, he found that the horizon to the south held nothing that he wanted more than what he was leaving behind him. He went back. He rode 20 feet out of Caldwell with the drive, and then he turned his horse around and rode back to Cal Ritter and said he was done for the season. Cal looked at him for a long moment with the squinting consideration of a man who had seen everything on the trail and had therefore stopped being surprised by most of it. Woman, Cal said. Among other things, Louis said. Cal spat into the dust. Your saddle and your gear are yours, he said. You were a good second. Come back next season if you want. He paused. Or don't. I expect you'll figure out which. Louis rode back to Caldwell. He found Lucy at the office, already at work, bent over a ledger of patient records that Dr. Graves kept in a system that she had been slowly reorganizing into something more logical, and she looked up when he pushed open the door, and her face did 3 things in sequence. Surprise, something complicated that she shut down almost immediately, and then the careful neutral expression of a woman managing her own reactions. You left this morning, she said. I turned around, he said. I can see that, she said. Why? He leaned against the door frame, which was apparently where he stood when he was not sure what else to do. I want to know you, he said. You told me you were not worth the trouble of knowing. I want to decide that for myself. She set down her pen. That is not how it works, she said. Which part? He asked. The deciding, she said. You cannot decide whether I am worth knowing. That is not. She stopped, started again. You left a job, Mr. Shelby. I left a seasonal position, he said. There will be another season. What are you going to do in Caldwell, she asked. Without the drive. There is work here, he said. The livery is short-handed, I know horses, and I have money saved. I can afford to think for a few weeks. She was looking at him with the expression that meant she was parsing something for several meanings at once. You are serious, she said. Generally, he said. You are serious right now, she clarified. Yes, he said. She was quiet for a long time, long enough that he began to consider whether he had miscalculated something important. Then she said, You should know that I do not intend to become someone different for the sake of anyone's comfort. I am going to keep working. I am going to keep being exactly who I am. I am counting on that, he said. The quiet that followed was different from the previous ones. It had something in it, a quality of beginning that neither of them quite knew what to do with yet. The livery owner's name is Frank Murdoch, she said finally. He is not easy to deal with, but he pays fairly. Tell him Dr. Graves sent you. Louis got the job at the livery. Frank Murdoch was 63 years old and had opinions about everything, and stated them constantly to anyone within range. But he knew a man who understood horses when he saw one, and Louis understood horses in the bone-deep way of someone who had spent 8 years crossing rivers and navigating darkness, and keeping a herd of longhorns moving through lightning storms. Within a week, Frank had given him the morning shift and the key to the tack room, and had told him 3 times that he hoped he planned to stay, which was the closest Frank got to a direct compliment. Louis found a room at the north end of town with a man named Burridge who rented out 2 rooms in his house, and who asked no questions beyond whether Louis could pay and whether he smoked, and Louis said yes and no, and that was apparently sufficient. And every day, between his work at the livery and her work at the office, Louis and Lucy found each other. It was not dramatic. It was not the kind of courtship that anyone wrote songs about. It was quiet and steady and real in the way that real things often are, without ornamentation, built of small, consistent acts rather than large gestures. He brought her coffee from the saloon on mornings when she had arrived at the office before the day was fully light. She told him about the patients she saw, the things she could and could not do within the limits of what she was allowed to be, and he listened without offering the kind of uninstructed advice that men who had not done something often gave to women who had. She asked him about the trail, about the ranch, about what the hill country of Texas looked like in winter, and he described it to her with the particular care of someone who wants another person to see what they see. They walked together on Sunday mornings after the town had slept off its Saturday night. The main street of Caldwell in the early Sunday light was as close to quiet as it ever got, and Lucy had discovered that those morning walks were the part of the week she began to organize everything else around. She did not say this to Louis. She did not need to. He already knew, the way he knew most things about her that she had not quite said directly, which was by paying the kind of attention that a person can only sustain for someone who matters to them. One Sunday in late August, almost a month after he had ridden back into Caldwell, they walked to the southern edge of town where the land opened up and the grass ran flat and enormous to the horizon, and the Oklahoma Territory began somewhere out in that grass in a way that had no visible marker, and Lucy said, "Tell me what happened in St. Louis." And then she looked at herself, slightly embarrassed. "I am sorry, I meant tell me what you left behind in Texas." "You said St. Louis," he noted quietly. "I know what I said," she said. "I do not know why I said it. I am sorry." "Do not be," he said. "There was a woman in St. Louis last year. She was a merchant's daughter. We were meant to be married." Lucy was very still. "I had saved enough to think about a place of my own," he said. "I thought I was ready. She thought she was ready. And then I came back from the winter's ranch work in March and she had married someone else in January. The merchant her father had always preferred." "I am sorry," Lucy said. "It hurt," he said, with the honesty that she had come to expect from him, the kind that did not dramatize and did not minimize. "And then it did not hurt, which surprised me. I think what I had wanted was the idea of something settled more than I had wanted her specifically, which is not a kind thing to say about anyone, and I am not proud of it, but I think it was true." "It is honest," she said. "I rode the drive this summer to think," he said. "And I rode into Caldwell and you fixed Hector's collarbone and told me to come back in the evening." She almost smiled. "And yet here you are." "And yet here I am," he agreed. Something settled between them in the open air, in the enormous Kansas sky that was the particular deep blue of late August, with clouds building to the north that might mean rain by afternoon. It was not declaration. It was not certainty. It was something softer and more durable than either of those, a recognition between two people who had been separately carrying things for a long time that perhaps they did not have to carry them entirely alone anymore. He took her hand. She let him. They stood there at the edge of the town looking south into the territory, and neither of them said anything for a while, because nothing needed to be said. September came to Caldwell with a shift in the wind and a change in the quality of the light. That particular amber heaviness that comes to the southern plains in early fall when the summer is finally over, but the winter has not yet announced itself. The cattle drive slowed and the town quieted, and the population of drovers who had been filling the saloons and the boarding houses thinned out to a more local density. Frank Murdoch told Louis he could have the job through winter if he wanted it, and Louis told him yes. Mrs. Prout, who had been watching the situation between her boarder and the livery man, with the particular interest of a woman who has seen a great deal of life, and knows what it looks like when two people are trying not to admit something to themselves, invited them both to dinner one Sunday in late September, which was either a kind gesture or an orchestrated event, and was probably both. Louis brought wine from the general store. Lucy made biscuits, which were excellent in a way that Mrs. Prout found privately satisfying, because she had always believed that a person who could not cook was a person who was not paying attention to the world, and Lucy Aldridge paid attention to everything. They sat in Mrs. Prout's dining room with the lamp lit against the early evening dark and the wind moving outside, and Mrs. Prout served a beef stew, and they ate together like people who had known each other longer than they had, which was the quality that settled contentment tends to produce in people who have found the right kind of company. Afterward, when Mrs. Prout had retired to her sitting room with her Bible and her shotgun and a comfortable kind of satisfaction, Louis and Lucy sat on the front porch in the cooling evening air, and Louis said, "I have been thinking." "You do a lot of that," she said. "I have been thinking about land," he said. "There is a parcel for sale at the land office, southeast of town, 20 acres with a well and a creek and some shelter trees. The price is fair." She was very still. "You are telling me this because," she started, "because I want to know what you think," he said, "because you are the person whose opinion on this I want most." She looked at the dark street for a moment. A coyote called somewhere far out on the plain, that thin, lonesome sound that carries across flat ground like something was trying to tell you something from a very great distance. "That is a question that has more inside it than what it sounds like," she said. "Yes," he said. "Louis," she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name and they both noticed it. "I need to tell you something." "All right," he said. "The thing I said about not being worth the trouble of knowing," she said. "I meant it when I said it. I was not performing modesty. I was telling you the real thing, which is that I came here broken in a way that I was not sure was fixable, and I was not sure I wanted anyone to try to fix it, because I had decided that the safest version of my life was one where I was useful to people from a careful distance." "I know," he said. "You do not know completely," she said, "because you have been very patient and I have been." She paused. "I have been happy, in a way that I had decided was not available to me anymore, and that frightens me more than anything that happened in St. Louis, because I know now what it costs when it goes wrong." "It does not have to go wrong," he said. "You cannot promise that," she said. "No," he said, "I cannot promise it. I can tell you that I am not Dr. Hartley. I can tell you that everything I have said to you in the last 2 months I have meant exactly as I said it. I can tell you that when I rode back into Caldwell after turning around at the edge of town, it was the most certain I have been about any decision in my adult life, and I do not make decisions carelessly." She was quiet for a long time. The coyote had stopped calling. The street was still. "Ask me again," she said. "What do you think about 20 acres southeast of town with a well and a creek and shelter trees?" he asked. "I think," she said slowly, "that 20 acres is a beginning." She looked at him. "And I think that a person who would turn a cattle drive around to come back and see me is probably worth knowing too." He reached over and took her hand again, the way he had on the south edge of town a month ago, and this time she leaned into his shoulder, just slightly, the way a person leans toward warmth when they have been cold for a long time and have finally decided it is all right to stop being cold. October arrived, and with it the first hints of the prairie winter, cold nights and frost on the grass in the mornings, and wood smoke rising from every chimney in Caldwell in the early light. Louis bought the 20 acres at the land office on a bright cold Tuesday morning and came out of the building with the deed in his coat pocket and stood on the boardwalk in the October air and felt like a man standing at a beginning. He went to the office. Lucy was with a patient, so he waited on the bench outside with his hat on his knee, and when she came out and saw his face, she stopped. "You bought it," she said. "I bought it," he said. She sat down on the bench beside him. "Let me see the deed." He gave it to her. She read it carefully, the way she read everything, with full attention, and then she handed it back. "It says Louis Shelby," she said. "That is my name," he said. "It is," she said, "for now." He looked at her. She was looking at the street with a small private expression that she was making absolutely no attempt to hide, and it was the most openly happy he had ever seen her look, and it was extraordinary. "Lucy," he said. "Yes," she said. "I know it has only been a little over 2 months," he said. "I know what 2 months is," she said. "I also know what this is. I want to marry you," he said. "Not because of the land, or because it is practical, or because it is what a man in my position is supposed to want. Because you are the most honest person I have met in my adult life, and you make me want to be worth knowing to the same degree that you are worth knowing, and that is a feeling I do not intend to let go of." She turned and looked at him fully. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with something adjacent to tears that lives in the same country. "I cannot promise I will be easy," she said. "I have never found easy worth much," he said. "I am going to keep working," she said. "I know," he said. "I would not want you to stop. Dr. Graves is talking about expanding the practice," she said. "There is a possibility that in another year or two, with the right credentials, I might be able to do more. Then we will make sure you have time for that," he said. She was quiet for a moment that felt like it held a great many things, a whole history of caution being set carefully down by someone who had carried it a very long way. "Yes," she said. "Yes, what?" he asked. "Yes," she said and smiled. "That was my answer. Yes." He kissed her on the bench outside Dr. Graves's office on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the cold October light. And Mrs. Pruitt walked past on her way to the general store and looked at them with the deeply satisfied expression of a woman who had suspected this was coming and was glad to have lived to see it. They were married in the church on the second Saturday of November, in a simple ceremony presided over by Minister Cole, with Margaret Cole as one witness and Frank Murdoch as the other, because Frank had become something like fond of Louis in the way that difficult people sometimes become fond of the one person who is not intimidated by them. Hector Vargas came up from Wichita for it, his collarbone fully healed and his life in Kansas starting in a way that seemed to be suiting him. Dr. Graves attended and told Lucy afterward that he was glad she had come to Caldwell, and that he intended to write to his contacts about the possibility of a more formal training credential for her. Mrs. Pruitt cried at the appropriate moments, and at a few additional ones, and did not seem embarrassed about any of them. Lucy wore a dress that was not white because the situation did not call for the specific symbolism of white in the way a first young marriage might. But that was a deep burgundy that was the color of late autumn berries, and suited her in a way that made Louis, when she walked into the church on Minister Cole's offered arm, forget for a moment what he had intended to say, and simply stand there at the front of the small room looking at her like she was something he had not quite let himself fully believe in until this moment. She saw his face when she came up the aisle, and the careful management that she had always applied to her expressions in public simply stopped working, and she was smiling by the time she reached him, fully and without reservation, in a way that the small congregation of people who had come to witness the thing would talk about afterward as the most beautiful part of the whole ceremony. Minister Cole read the words. They said the words. Louis put a ring on her finger that he had ordered from a silversmith in Wichita through the general store, a plain silver band with a small turquoise stone that he had chosen, because it was the color of the Kansas sky on a clear winter day, and because it was real, a real stone in a real setting, not decorative paste, which seemed right for a woman who had no patience for things that were not what they claimed to be. She looked at the ring for a long time after it was on her finger. "It suits you," Margaret Cole said at the small reception in the church's front room afterward, and Lucy looked down at it again and said, "Yes, it does." And she sounded surprised in a way that was not about the ring. They moved to the 20 acres southeast of town before winter properly arrived. There was a small existing structure on the land, a two-room house with a sound roof that had been built by the previous owner, and then abandoned when that man had moved further west following his wife and 3 children, who had apparently not been willing to wait for him to make up his mind about whether Kansas was where they were staying. Louis had spent 2 weeks in October and early November making the house properly livable, with help from Frank Murdoch, who came out one Saturday with lumber and opinions in equal measure, and from Dr. Graves, who was less useful with lumber but could hold a board while someone else nailed it, and who seemed to find the whole enterprise deeply enjoyable. The house was small. It was warm. It had a window on the east side that got the morning light, and a cast iron stove that heated the main room so well that in the deep cold of January, when the wind came off the territory, and the temperature dropped below freezing, and the snow came in thin hard lines across the flat ground, they were comfortable in a way that still surprised Lucy every morning when she woke up. She woke up surprised for other reasons too. Surprised to be happy in such an uncomplicated way. Surprised to find that happiness, which she had approached with such careful skepticism for the last several years, was actually quite simple when the person you were happy with was someone worth being happy with. She had expected that the closeness of marriage, the daily proximity of another person's habits and needs and presence, would be a thing she had to manage. She found instead that Louis's company was as natural as breathing and considerably more enjoyable. He woke early and made coffee, and she drank it sitting at the kitchen table in her robe with her hair loose, which was not how she had ever imagined herself in any domestic scene, but which turned out to be completely fine. He had a way of moving through the early morning that was quiet and purposeful without being demanding of anything from her before she was ready, which was, she had come to understand, a rarer quality in a person than it should have been. She continued to work with Dr. Graves through the winter. She rode into town 3 days a week on the horse Louis had selected for her at the livery, with the specific care of a man choosing something important, a steady bay mare named, unimaginatively, Bay by Louis, and then renamed Cinder by Lucy because of the gray around her muzzle. On the days she worked, Louis rode with her to the edge of town, and was there in the evening to ride back with her, not because she needed an escort, but because the ride together was one of the quiet pleasures of their days. In January of 1879, word reached Caldwell through the telegraph that caused a change in Dr. Graves's plans. His brother in Cincinnati had suffered a serious illness, and Graves needed to go east for several months to see to his affairs and possibly bring his brother back west if recovery allowed. He sat Lucy down in the office and told her that he had spoken with the county authorities and that she was to be the acting medical provider for Caldwell in his absence, with a stipend paid by the county, a formal letter of authorization, and his full set of supplies and instruments. Lucy was very still for a moment. "The county agreed to a woman?" she asked. "The county agreed to someone who has been managing the practice competently for the last 4 months, and who everyone in this town already comes to," Graves said dryly. "Sometimes the actual situation is more persuasive than the principle. I also told them I was not leaving without making sure someone competent was in place, and that you were the only competent person available." "That is a persuasive argument," she said. "You will have help," he said. "I have contacted a physician in Wichita who has agreed to ride out monthly to review cases and provide any support you need. His name is Dr. Abraham Wallace, and he is a reasonable man who cares about the work more than the politics of who does it." She took the letter of authorization when he left in February, and she kept it in the top drawer of the desk in the office. And on the morning after he left, she sat in the chair behind the desk for a long moment in the quiet of the room with the winter light coming through the window, and felt something that she could only describe as the sensation of becoming, in some official capacity, the person she had always been capable of being. She told Louis about it that evening sitting by the stove, and he listened to the whole thing with his full attention, and when she was done he said, "You are going to be extraordinary at this." "I already am," she said, and it was not arrogance. It was something she had earned the right to say. He grinned. "Yes," he said, "you already are." Spring came to the 20 acres with the particular sweetness of a plain spring, where the grass comes up green and sudden after the winter, and the sky opens up blue and enormous, and the creek at the edge of their property ran clear and cold, and the shelter trees came into leaf with a speed that always seemed to surprise people who had not watched it happen before. Louis had planted a kitchen garden along the south side of the house in late April, a practical endeavor in both vegetables and a small plot of herbs that Lucy needed for her work. And the garden grew with the specific enthusiasm of soil that had not been cultivated in some time, and had a great deal of energy to express. They had a neighbor to the north, a farmer named Silas Webb, who ran wheat and kept his own company, and who regarded the new couple on the 20 acres to his south with the cautious reserve of a man who has been burned by bad neighbors in the past. He did not come by in the first weeks after they moved in. He sent his wife, Clara Webb, who came one morning in early spring with a pie and an openness about her purpose that Lucy found refreshing. "My husband wants to know if you are going to be a problem," Clara said, setting the pie on the table and sitting down as if she had been invited, which Lucy liked about her immediately. "I told him you were not going to be a problem. I thought I should come and make sure." "We are not going to be a problem," Lucy said, pouring coffee. "You are a doctor," Clara said. "I work with a doctor," Lucy said, "officially." "In practice," Clara pressed. "In practice, yes," Lucy said. Clara studied her with a Midwestern directness that recognized itself in Lucy's answering steadiness. "Good," Clara said, "because we have not had anyone close in a medical capacity since the last doctor before Graves, and before him I had to take my children to Wichita, which is a long way when a child has a fever." "How many children?" Lucy asked. "4," Clara said. "3 boys and a girl. The girl is the youngest and the most determined to cause me trouble." Lucy smiled. "Bring them to me the next time anyone has a fever," she said. "There is no reason to ride to Wichita." Clara left an hour later in a state of considerable satisfaction, and within a week Silas Webb had also appeared, hat in hand, to introduce himself to Louis, and to ask whether he had any interest in sharing the cost of a new irrigation channel that would benefit both their properties. Which was the beginning of a practical and eventually genuine friendship between two men who were not particularly effusive, but who understood hard work and fair dealing, and who found in each other a reliable version of both. Summer came again, 1879, and the Chisholm Trail drives came through, and Caldwell filled back up with drovers and noise and the particular energy of a cattle town in its working season, and Lucy worked long days through it, because the summer always brought its own variety of injuries and ailments. She set 3 more broken bones. She treated a serious knife wound that required all of her skill and a significant amount of concentration to avoid infection. She managed an outbreak of stomach illness that moved through a group of drovers camped south of town, and that she correctly identified as coming from a contaminated water source she persuaded the town council to address. Dr. Wallace came from Wichita each month as promised, and was a quiet-spoken man of 50 who reviewed her records and her decisions with the careful eye of someone who had learned long ago that competence comes in a great many forms, and who told her clearly on his 3rd visit that he had nothing of significance to correct. Louis expanded the kitchen garden and began to develop a plan for a small cattle operation of his own, nothing on the scale of the rocking T, but a beginning, some breeding stock, and the ambition to grow it over 5 years into something that would justify the 20 acres and perhaps allow them to acquire more. He went back to the Rocking T Drive in the summer of 1879, but only for a month, a contracted position helping Cal Ritter through a section of the drive that had lost 2 hands to illness, and he was back in Caldwell by July. He brought Hector Vargas back with him, because Hector had been thinking about cattle work again and was tired of the livery in Wichita, and Louis offered him a fair wage and room in the house's second room, which was not large but was better than most bunkhouses Hector had slept in. Hector also brought the girl from the church dance, who was not precisely a girl anymore but a 20-year-old named Elena Ruiz, whose family had been in the territory for 2 generations, and who had been corresponding with Hector for the better part of a year. She came with her older brother, Miguel, who had come to ensure that whatever situation his sister was moving toward was a suitable one, and who departed a week later with something like approval of Hector, considerably more comfort about Elena's circumstances after meeting Lucy and Louis, and a standing invitation to return that he accepted twice in the following year. Hector and Elena were married the following spring in a ceremony that Lucy helped plan, and which took place in the same church where Louis and Lucy had been married 16 months before, and Minister Cole expressed quietly to Margaret that he found the repetition of the thing deeply satisfying. In September of 1879, Lucy told Louis she thought she was pregnant. She said it in the evening after supper, very directly, in the way she said everything, and Louis set down his coffee cup and looked at her across the table with an expression that she could not immediately read, which was unusual because she could generally read him very well. "You are certain?" he asked. "Not completely," she said, "but close to certain. I will know more in 2 weeks." He was quiet for a moment, and then he got up from the table and came around to her side and knelt down beside her chair, which was something she had not expected him to do, and he took both her hands and looked at her in a way that was so unguarded that it made her throat ache. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said. "So am I," he said. "Is that all right?" She laughed, which was not what she had expected to do. "Yes," she said. "That is very all right." 2 weeks later she was certain. She told Dr. Wallace when he came for his monthly visit, and he looked at her with a measured warmth, and said he knew an excellent physician in Wichita who specialized in difficult cases, and that she should have no hesitation in calling on him if she needed anything. She also wrote a letter to Dr. Graves, who had returned to Caldwell from Cincinnati in the summer with his brother, who had recovered enough to travel, and who had decided that perhaps the West suited him after all. Graves wrote back promptly with the kind of practical and emotionally contained congratulations that she would have expected from him, and that she found, for that reason, genuinely touching. She worked through the pregnancy with the pragmatism that she applied to everything. She modified what she could not do easily and continued doing everything she still could, and she was honest with herself about the line between the two, which was not always where other people might have drawn it. Louis worried, which he did quietly and practically, making sure the wood was always in and the stove was always warm and that there was always something good to eat in the house, without ever suggesting that her working was something he felt anxious about, because he understood that stopping her from working would have been its own kind of harm. Their son was born in May of 1880. It was a long labor, and Dr. Graves was present and Clara Webb was present, and Louis was in the kitchen doing the most useful thing he could manage, which was being there without being in the way and having water heated when it was needed and being very steady, because steadiness was the thing he had to offer, and it was not a small thing. When Dr. Graves came out of the bedroom and told him he had a son, Louis sat down in the kitchen chair and pressed his hands against his face for a moment in a way that was the exact shape of relief. They named the boy James William Shelby. James for no particular reason except that it was a good solid name that both of them agreed suited him, and William for Lucy's father, who had been a good man and who had been gone 12 years, and who she had thought of often in the months of the pregnancy when she had turned something important over in her mind and decided that she was, after all, capable of being someone's mother. She had not been sure of that once. She was sure of it now. James William Shelby arrived in the world with opinions about it that he expressed continuously and at volume, which made Clara Webb laugh when she heard him from the kitchen and say, "He sounds like a healthy one." He was, in fact, entirely healthy, and he had Louis's gray eyes and Lucy's dark hair, and a personality that was apparent within the first week, and that combined his mother's directness with his father's steadiness in a combination that Dr. Graves, holding the baby on his fourth day of life with an expression of cautious wonder, said was either going to be very easy or very interesting to raise. "Both," Lucy said from the bed. "I am counting on both." Louis sat on the edge of the bed beside her with James in his arms and the late spring light coming through the east window and the creek running audibly outside in its banks after the good winter snow, and he looked at his wife who had come to Caldwell with a carpet-bag and a letter and a heart that she had been carrying like it was already broken, and she looked back at him with eyes that were tired and bright and full of something that had no more caution in it. "You are extraordinary," he said. "You said that before," she said. "It is still true," he said. She leaned her head against his shoulder, and he held their son, and outside the window the Kansas summer was beginning in earnest. All that enormous blue sky, and the grass running green to the horizon, and the 20 acres that had once been a stranger's abandoned beginning, was theirs now in every sense that mattered. Dr. Graves formally expanded Lucy's position in the practice that fall, making her his official partner in a designation that was, as he explained to the county council, with the particular legislative patience of a man who knows he is going to win eventually, simply a recognition of what had been true for more than a year. There was some argument about it. There was always some argument about things that required people to accept that they had been wrong in their previous arrangements. But Dr. Graves was not a man who was easily moved from a position he had thought through, and Lucy's record over the previous 18 months was not easy to argue with. The county council accepted the arrangement in October of 1880, and Lucy came home that evening and told Louis, and Louis opened the bottle of whiskey he had been keeping on the shelf for a significant occasion and poured 2 glasses and said, "To Dr. Lucy Aldridge." "I am not a doctor," she said. "I am a medical partner. It is different, and I am not going to call it something it is not." "To medical partner Lucy Shelby, then," he said. She picked up her glass. "That one I will take," she said. They drank to it. James, who was 5 months old and had developed the ability to observe things with a focus that both his parents found slightly unnerving in its resemblance to Lucy's own diagnostic attention, watched them from his basket near the stove and appeared to find the proceedings reasonable. The years that followed were built of the same material as the first ones, work and weather, and the specific daily pleasures of 2 people who have found the right kind of life together, and who understand what they have. Louis's small cattle operation grew steadily. By 1882, he had 12 head of breeding stock and had purchased an additional 15 acres to the east of their original parcel. He hired 2 men to help with the ranch work and paid them fairly and treated them the way he himself had always wanted to be treated on the trail, which was with the understanding that a man's labor is worth what it is worth, and there is no virtue in pretending otherwise. Silas Webb, who had become by this time a genuine friend rather than a wary neighbor, partnered with Louis on a fence project in 1881 that reorganized the property boundaries between their 2 farms in a way that benefited both, and the negotiation of that project, which involved 3 long evenings at the Shelby kitchen table and considerable amounts of coffee, resulted in a clarity and mutual respect between the 2 households that became one of the lasting features of their shared years in that part of Kansas. Hector and Elena, living on a small property of their own that Louis had helped them find south of town, had their first child in 1881, a girl they named Rosa, who arrived with the same opinions about the world that James Shelby had expressed 16 months earlier, and who would become, when both children were old enough to run, James's most dedicated opponent in every game invented on the combined properties of two families who had become, in everything but blood, family. Lucy lost a patient in the spring of 1882. A young man of 23 from a drive that had come up from Texas, who had been thrown from his horse and had sustained an internal injury that she had not had the tools or the knowledge to fully address. She did everything she could, and she knew she had done everything she could, and Dr. Graves told her clearly that there was nothing more she could have done, and that Dr. Wallace agreed when she wrote to him, and none of that made it any easier. She was quiet for several days in the particular way that grief makes people quiet, not withdrawn, just carrying something. Louis did not try to fix it. He was there and he listened when she needed to talk, and he was quiet when she needed silence. And on the fourth evening after it happened, when she sat at the kitchen table in the late light with her hands around a cup of tea that had gone cold and said, "I keep thinking about what I could have done differently," he said. "I know. And I think that is the thing that makes you good at what you do, and I am sorry that it costs what it costs." She looked at him. "That is not very comforting," she said. "No," he agreed, "but it is true," she nodded slowly. "Yes," she said, "it is true." In 1883 she discovered she was pregnant again. She told Louis in the same way she had told him the first time, directly and over the kitchen table, and this time he did not kneel beside her chair but reached across the table and took her hand and said, "How are you feeling?" "Tired," she said, "but well." "I will do more of the heavy chores," he said. "Louis," she said. "I know," he said. "I know you are going to say you are capable." "I was going to say thank you," she said. He smiled. "Then thank you for letting me help." Their daughter arrived in February of 1884, in the deep of a Kansas winter that had the temperature down below zero and the snow coming sideways off the territory. And Clara Webb arrived at the house 2 hours before the baby came, driving through the snow in Silas's wagon, because she was not going to let Lucy Shelby do this without another woman present. And she said so, with the flat practicality of someone who has had 4 children of her own and knows what is needed. The baby was born in the warmth of the well-heated house, with the snow pressing against the windows and Dr. Graves there and Clara there, and Louis keeping everything running the way he always did, and James, who was 3.5 years old and had been told the baby was coming, and had prepared for the event by drawing a picture of it with charcoal on a piece of paper, asleep in his room by the time his sister arrived. They named her Margaret Ruth Shelby. Margaret for Margaret Cole, who had shown Lucy the lending library on a cold October morning, and who had become one of the quiet pillars of her friendship in Caldwell. And Ruth, because it was a name that meant something in the history of loyalty and choosing to stay. And Lucy had always admired people who chose to stay. When James met his sister in the morning light of the following day, he regarded her with the serious assessment of a 3-year-old conducting an important evaluation, and then looked at Louis and said, "She is very small." "She will get bigger," Louis said. "Good," James said, apparently satisfied, and went to eat his breakfast. The spring of 1884 brought other news to Caldwell. Dr. Graves, who had been managing a health condition of his own with characteristic quiet efficiency, told Lucy in April that he was going to retire from active practice by the summer. His eyes had been failing him for a year, and a physician could not do the work without vision. He said it plainly and without self-pity, and Lucy heard it the same way because they had always spoken to each other plainly. "What happens to the practice?" she asked. "I am signing it to you," he said. "The instruments, the office, the patient records, the county contract, all of it. Dr. Wallace has agreed to provide formal oversight and certification. You will be, as far as the county of Sedgwick is concerned, the medical provider for Caldwell." She was silent for a moment. "Emmett," she said, which was the first time she had used his first name in 4 years of working together. "Lucy," he said, in the same tone, which meant he knew what she was feeling and that she did not need to say it for him to have heard it. She took the practice in June of 1884. She hired a young woman from a farm east of town, a sharp-minded 17-year-old named Dorothy Harris who wanted to learn, and who Lucy began teaching with the same thorough directness that had characterized her own instruction. Dr. Wallace came monthly, and eventually quarterly, and eventually only when Lucy wrote to say there was a case she wanted his second opinion on, because it had become gradually and undeniably apparent that Lucy Aldridge Shelby's medical judgment was extremely good and that the oversight was increasingly a formality. She wrote to Dr. Hartley once, in 1885. The letter was not vindictive. It was not pleading. It was a single page that said, in its essence, that she had built something of significance in Caldwell, Kansas, and that she was writing to inform him that whatever he had thought he had accomplished by damaging her reputation in St. Louis had not accomplished it, and that she thought he should know this. She signed it with her full name and her medical title and her address. She did not know if he read it. She did not think about whether he responded. The sending of it was what mattered, and after she sent it she felt something in her chest settle that had been slightly unsettled for 7 years, and she went home and told Louis what she had done. He listened carefully and then said, "Do you feel better?" "Yes," she said. "Good," he said. "That is all that mattered about it." James started at the Caldwell School in 1886 at 6 years old and immediately distinguished himself as someone with views about things that he was going to express whether or not the expressing was convenient. His teacher, a patient man named Mr. Aldis, told Lucy at the end of the first month that James was advanced and engaged and had a tendency to correct factual errors in a way that was entirely accurate and not exactly tactful. Lucy told Mr. Aldis that she would work on the tact. She did work on it, and James improved, and Mr. Aldis told Louis the following spring that James was the best reader in his class, which Louis found difficult to be surprised by. Margaret, at 2, had already developed the specific quality of determination that sits in some children from the very beginning, before they have the vocabulary to explain it, but which is apparent in how they climb things and refuse to be carried and insist on doing everything themselves even when they cannot yet do it adequately, and which would eventually become, in an adult woman, a strength that her parents could already see the shape of. Louis expanded the cattle operation again in 1887, bringing the herd to 35 head and the property to 60 acres, with the purchase of an additional parcel to the south that connected their land to the creek in a more useful way. He was not a wealthy man by the standards of the great cattle ranchers of the era, but he was a man who owned what he had built and owed nothing to anyone for it. And in that particular sense of self-sufficiency, he was exactly what he had wanted to be. He was also, by 1887, the man that everyone in Caldwell south of town came to when something broke or needed negotiating or required a steady head in a difficult situation, not because he sought it, but because that was what happened to men who had that quality of careful reliability over a period of years. Silas Webb brought him into a dispute with the railroad company over a right-of-way that was affecting several farms in the area, and Louis helped organize the affected landowners and write a clear account of their position that they submitted to the railroad's regional office. And the dispute was eventually resolved in terms that were fair if not entirely satisfying, which was about as good as you got with railroad companies in 1887 Kansas. Hector had by then 3 children, Rosa and her 2 brothers, and ran a small horse trading operation that Louis had helped him establish, and which had grown into something that kept Hector busy and satisfied in the way that a man is satisfied when the work he does is the work he is genuinely suited for. Alina and Lucy had become the kind of friends who do not need to explain themselves to each other, which is the best and rarest kind of friendship, and which had developed the way real things develop, slowly, and through the accumulation of shared time and shared difficulty and shared laughter. In the evenings of 1887, when the cattle work was done and the children were in bed, Louis and Lucy sat on the porch of the house they had expanded twice, and which now had 4 rooms and a proper kitchen, and a covered porch that Louis had built over 2 weekends in the spring. And they looked at the same Kansas sky that had been above them for 9 years and which was still, as it had always been, enormous and indifferent and beautiful. "Do you remember what you said to me?" Lucy asked one evening in September of that year, with the night coming on warm and the stars beginning to appear in the east, on the main street of Caldwell, before we were anything. "I said a lot of things," he said. "I told you I was not worth the trouble of knowing," she said. He was quiet for a moment, remembering it clearly the way he remembered everything about those first weeks, the dusty street and the cold October air, and the way she had stood with her bag on her shoulder and her bonnet tied, and looked at him like she needed him to understand something important and was not sure he would. "And I said I had never found trouble worth avoiding," he said. "I thought that was reckless when you said it," she said. "And now?" he asked. She looked at the stars, which were out in force now, the Milky Way coming clear across the black sky the way it did out here away from the lights of town. "Now I think it was the truest thing you ever said," she said. He reached over and took her hand, the same way he had taken it on the south edge of town 9 years ago, and she leaned into his shoulder the same way she had then, and they sat together in the warm September dark and listened to the creek and the cattle in the south pasture, and the very faint sound of James moving in his room, probably reading by candlelight when he was supposed to be asleep, which was both entirely predictable and entirely fine. In 1888, Caldwell had grown. The cattle drives were beginning to shift west as the railheads extended, and the trail routes changed with the expanding rail network, and Caldwell was adapting from a trail-end cattle town into something more settled, a farming community with a growing permanent population and the particular civic concerns that come with permanence. There was a new schoolhouse and a more substantial bank, and a second physician who had joined Dr. Wallace's practice in Wichita, and who came to Caldwell once a month specifically to work with Lucy on the more complex cases. Lucy had 3 of her own students by then. Dorothy Harris, who was 21 and already managing a significant portion of the routine practice work under Lucy's supervision. A young man of 20 named Andrew Price, whose family had come from Ohio, and who wanted to study medicine, and who found in Lucy's practical, evidence-based approach exactly the kind of instruction he had been looking for. And Clara Webb's oldest boy, Robert, who had been following Lucy around since he was 12 years old asking questions about everything she did, and who at 18 had a natural aptitude for the work that Lucy had told. Clara was going to take him much further than Caldwell if he chose to pursue it. Clara Webb had cried when Lucy told her that about Robert, right there in the Shelby kitchen with the afternoon sun coming through the window and James doing his schoolwork at the table. And Lucy had said, "It is a compliment, Clara," and Clara had said, I know it is. I am not sad." And they had both laughed because Clara was clearly somewhat sad, in the way that parents are sad about children who are going to go somewhere large and be something magnificent. Louis turned 36 in the spring of 1888 and celebrated it by falling off a fence he was repairing, which he had not done in 15 years on the trail and which he attributed to a momentary lapse of attention that he declined to specify further. He landed in the soft ground beside the post and was not injured except in his dignity, and came into the kitchen afterward to find Lucy already standing at the window. "I saw," she said. "I know you saw," he said. "Are you hurt?" She asked. "No," he said. "Good," she said, and turned away to hide the fact that she was smiling. He came up behind her and put his arms around her, and she leaned back against him, and they stood for a moment in the afternoon kitchen, with the light on the walls, and the sound of Margaret in the yard, and the cattle somewhere in the south pasture, and the whole enormous quiet of their life around them. "I love you," he said, not because the moment required it particularly, but because it was true and he said it when it was true, which was one of the things about him that she had come to value so deeply that she could not always say it directly. "I love you," she said, which she had learned to say without the prior caution, which had taken time and which was still sometimes an act of deliberate intention, but which she meant with every part of herself. Margaret appeared at the kitchen door at that moment and announced, at 4 years old and with complete conviction, that the cat had eaten the butter off the table and that this was a crisis requiring immediate adult attention. The crisis was managed. The butter was replaced. The cat expressed no remorse. James came home from school with a drawing of a horse he had done in arithmetic class, which suggested that his attention had not been fully on the arithmetic, and Louis told him with great seriousness that the horse was excellent and that his arithmetic could probably wait until morning, which Lucy objected to with insufficient conviction to be persuasive. That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Lucy sat at the kitchen table with the medical records she had been updating, and Louis sat across from her reading a letter from Cal Ritter, who had written to say he was retiring from the trail, and that the rocking tee had a new owner, and that if Louis ever wanted to come back for a drive for old times' sake the door was open, which was Cal Ritter's version of a sentimental letter, and which Louis read twice and set on the table. "What does it say?" Lucy asked without looking up from her records. "Cal Ritter is retiring," Louis said. She looked up then. "The trail boss." "The same," he said. She considered him for a moment. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The trail." He thought about it honestly, the way she had always valued. "I miss the horizon," he said. "The way it looked every morning from the saddle, but I have that here." He looked at her. "And I have everything else here. I do not miss anything that matters." She looked at him steadily. "Good," she said, "because I have no intention of going anywhere." "Neither do I," he said. She went back to her records. He folded Cal Ritter's letter and put it in his coat pocket, not for any particular reason, except that it was from someone he had worked well with for 8 years, and that felt worth keeping. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and cold and full of stars, and the creek ran in its banks beside the 60 acres that were theirs, and the house was warm and well lit, and full of the specific living quiet of a family that has found its place in the world. The last decade of the century came to Caldwell the way last decades tend to come, with the feeling that things had been building towards something, and that the something was now quite clearly here. The cattle drives were done for practical purposes by 1891, the rail network having transformed the economics of the cattle trade in ways that made the long trail north not only unnecessary but inefficient. And Caldwell made its peace with being a farming town, which it did with a pragmatism that said something genuine about the people who had chosen to stay there. Louis's cattle operation continued, smaller than the big trail ranches but viable and carefully managed, and by 1892 he had established a reputation for the quality of his breeding stock that brought buyers from Wichita and once from as far east as Kansas City, who came to look at the herd, and ended up also talking to Louis about land management practices that he had developed over 13 years of careful observation, and who left with 2 steers and considerably more ideas than they had arrived with. James Shelby, at 12, was reading medical texts he borrowed from his mother's office and asking questions about them that she answered as fully as she could, and that increasingly required her to write to Dr. Wallace or to her new colleague for the parts that exceeded her own practical training. She told Louis one evening that she thought James might become a physician. "Actually become one," she said. "A licensed doctor. He has the mind for it." Louis considered this. Where would he study? "St. Louis," she said, and then caught herself smiling at the particular irony of it. "Or Kansas City. There is a medical school, or Chicago. There are more options than there were." "He is 12, Louis said. "I know," she said, "but it is worth thinking about now, for the planning." He looked at her with the affection that had never lost its warmth despite the years, which was the specific quality of love that she had not believed in when she arrived in Caldwell and had come to understand was the most real kind. "You have already been planning," he said. "I have been thinking," she said. "That is different." "You say that every time," he said. "Because every time it is true," she said. Margaret, at 8, had no current interest in medicine and every interest in horses, which she had inherited from Louis in the same direct way she had inherited his gray eyes. She could ride with a confidence that Lucy, who was a competent but never natural rider, found both admirable and sometimes alarming to watch. Louis had given her a pony of her own at 6, and she had had it at full gallop by 7, and by 8 she was helping him with the horses in a way that was genuinely useful and not merely indulgent. "She is going to be remarkable," Louis told Lucy one evening, watching Margaret in the south pasture with the horses moving around her. "She already is," Lucy said, which was the same thing she had said to him in the office in 1879, and which he recognized and smiled at. The summer of 1893 brought the arrival of a letter that changed one part of their life in a significant and completely resolved way. It came from Cincinnati, from the man who had recovered from his illness and who had stayed there after accompanying Dr. Graves east in 1879, and who had become, in the intervening 14 years, someone who felt no connection to Kansas at all. But it also contained a separate note inside, written in a hand Lucy recognized as Dr. Hartley's, because she had spent a year reading his handwriting on patient records and prescriptions. The note said only this: "I understand now that I was wrong. I have told those who will listen. I am sorry for what I did to you." She read it twice and then put it in the drawer of her desk and sat for a moment with her hands folded on the desk surface. It was 14 years too late. It was also something in the particular way that a thing is something when it is the only version of it you are going to get. She wrote back a single line, "Thank you for saying so," and she sent it, and that was the end of it, closed fully and finally. She told Louis that evening. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like a door that has been slightly ajar for a long time just closed properly," she said. He nodded. "Good," he said. "Leave it closed." "I already have," she said. In 1895, James was accepted to the medical school in Kansas City. He was 15 and would not be going for another 3 years. But the acceptance was conditional on his completing his secondary education, with the marks his preliminary examination had indicated he was capable of, and he returned from the examination with the letter, and set it on the kitchen table with the particular expression of someone who is trying not to show how pleased they are. Lucy read it and looked at Louis, and Louis looked at her, and they both looked at James, who was now taller than his mother and was beginning to look more like Louis in the plane of his face while retaining Lucy's eyes, which were the brown eyes that read things before people finished explaining themselves. "Well done," Louis said. "It is conditional," James said. "Meet the conditions," Lucy said, "which you will." "You do not know that," he said. "I know you," she said. He looked at the table. "I want to come back," he said. Come back here. There is more work to do here than there will ever be in a city." Lucy looked at her son for a long moment and felt something that had no other word for it than continuation, the sense that the work she had done and the life she had built was not ending when she was done but continuing forward in forms she had helped shape. "Then come back," she said. "There will be work waiting." Margaret was 11 in 1895, and the horses were still her primary concern, though she had also developed a fierce interest in mathematics that her teacher described as unusual, and that Lucy considered entirely consistent with who her daughter was. She had Clara Webb's youngest daughter as her best friend, and the two of them had a private project of some kind that involved the creek and a great deal of planning and the occasional appearance of mud that neither of them ever fully accounted for. Louis, at 43, was a man who had stopped being surprised by his own life's pleasures, which he considered the best thing about being his age. He knew what he had. He had worked for it, and it had worked for him, and the 60 acres to the south of Caldwell, Kansas, had become a place in the world that held its own kind of permanence, the kind that comes from being fully inhabited by people who mean to stay. One evening in October of 1895, they walked out to the south edge of their property the way they had walked on the south edge of Caldwell town 17 years before, when the Oklahoma Territory had been just a suggestion in the grass to the south, and they stood at the fence line, with the last of the light going orange and purple to the west, and the enormous Kansas sky doing what it always did, which was remind you how small any individual thing was, and how beautiful that was rather than diminishing. "Do you remember the first time I told you to go away?" Lucy said. "You did not tell me to go away," Louis said. "You said good afternoon. That was clearly a goodbye." "It was a goodbye," she said, "and you came back the next morning." "I brought sugar candy," he said. "You brought sugar candy," she agreed. "It was the best courtship gift I received, better than flowers." "There were no flowers worth cutting," he said. "I maintained that position." She laughed, and it was the full laugh, the one without any management in it, the one that had been growing fuller and less managed since that first October morning in 1878. She leaned into his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stood at the fence looking at the sky that went on and on. "I did not think this was available to me," she said. "Any of this. When I came to Caldwell, I thought I was starting something practical, a useful life, work that mattered. I did not think." She paused. "I had stopped thinking about the rest of it." "The rest of it," he said. "This," she said. "The whole of it, you, the children, the land, the life." She looked up at the sky. "It turned out to be the most available thing in the world. I just needed to stop blocking the door." He held her a little more closely. "For what it is worth," he said, "I had stopped thinking about it too, not believing in it, just not expecting it. And then Hector broke his collarbone in a lightning stampede and I rode into Caldwell looking for a doctor." "Hector's collarbone," she said. "I should send him a letter thanking him." "He already knows," Louis said. "He told me last summer that the thing he is most proud of in his life besides his children is that his collarbone healed wrong, so that I went looking for a doctor and found you." She was quiet for a moment. "That is a lovely thing to say." "Hector is sentimental," Louis said. "He has always been sentimental." "So are you," she said. "You just hide it better." "I do not hide it," he said. "You delay it," she said, "which is the same thing dressed differently." He was smiling. She could feel it against the top of her head where she was leaning into him. "All right," he said. "I delay it." They stayed there until the last light was gone and the stars were out, and then they walked back to the house together through the dark grass with the sound of the creek and the cattle and the house lights ahead of them, warm and gold in the prairie night. James would be inside doing his schoolwork, and Margaret would be trying to avoid doing hers, and the cat that had eaten the butter in 1888 had been replaced by a successor cat named by Margaret Sargent, who had no more remorse than his predecessor, but who was better at catching the mice that came into the barn in winter. And all of this was entirely ordinary and entirely extraordinary in the way that a life lived well tends to be. They went inside. Louis put more wood in the stove. Lucy checked the schoolwork. Margaret negotiated with some success for an extension on the reading assignment. James asked his mother a question about the circulatory system that he had found in one of the medical texts, and that she answered fully, and then told him to write down the answer, because she was going to ask him about it in the morning. Later, when the house was quiet and the children were asleep, and the fire in the stove had settled to a steady warmth, Lucy sat at the kitchen table with the lamp lit low, and Louis sat across from her, not reading and not doing anything in particular, just there in the comfortable way that people are there when they have been each other's company for long enough that presence is itself the thing. "We should tell James about the Kansas City situation soon," she said. "Start planning in earnest. 3 years will go faster than we think." "I know," he said. "And Margaret needs to be encouraged with the mathematics," she said. "Her teacher thinks she could go further with it. There are schools in the East that teach it properly." "She will want to stay with the horses," Louis said. "She can want both," Lucy said. "People can want more than one thing." He looked at her with the gray eyes that had been looking at her for 17 years with the same quality of attention, undiminished and unhurried. "They can," he said, "and sometimes they get both." She met his eyes across the table. "Yes," she said, "sometimes they do." The lamp burned steady in the warm kitchen of the house on 60 acres of Kansas land in the fall of 1895, and outside the enormous prairie dark went on and on to every horizon, and the creek ran quiet in its banks, and the cattle were settled in the south pasture, and 2 children slept the deep sleep of children who are safe and known and loved, and the man and the woman who had built all of it sat together in the light of a lamp that would burn until they were ready to sleep. She was the woman who had told him she was not worth the trouble of knowing. He was the man who had never found trouble worth avoiding. And they had been right, both of them, in the way that 2 people are right when they have found, against all the odds that the world is very good at creating, exactly the life they were made for.